Before the cavalry could ride into the storm, before Eagle Troop could push past the limit of advance, before 73 Easting became a name people used for modern armored war, someone had to open the door. That door was not made of wood or steel, but of mines, wire, trenches, berms, anti-tank ditches, bunkers, and fear. It lay in the Iraqi defensive belt, facing the coalition's heavy forces, a crust of prepared positions meant to slow armor, break up formations, and turn speed into wreckage. On February 24, 1991, the 1st Infantry Division, the old Big Red One, took on that job. Its mission was plain in wording and brutal in meaning: breach the Iraqi line so the armored campaign could pass through.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. A breach is one of the least romantic acts in land warfare, and that is why it deserves attention. It is not a sweeping cavalry maneuver or a clean tank duel at long range. It is hard, deliberate work against obstacles placed precisely to make men cautious and machines vulnerable. Mines wait without noise. Wire catches infantry and marks lanes for enemy fire. Ditches stop vehicles long enough for artillery and anti-tank weapons to find them. Trenches protect defenders and hide them close to the ground. The attacker must create openings through all of this, while under the possibility of fire, confusion, and mechanical failure. If the breach fails, the whole beautiful arrow on the campaign map can fold into a traffic jam.
The 1st Infantry Division's name can mislead listeners who hear infantry and imagine men walking forward unsupported. By 1991, this was a heavy mechanized formation with tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, artillery, engineers, air defense, logistics, and command systems wrapped around its infantry corps. It was built to fight as a combined arms team. That mattered because no single branch could solve the breach alone. Tanks could suppress enemy positions, but they could not calmly clear every mine by themselves. Infantry could enter trenches and deal with bunkers, but they needed protection and fire support to reach them. Engineers could cut lanes and mark routes, but they were vulnerable while doing it. Artillery and aircraft could hammer defenders, but someone still had to go forward into the obstacle belt and physically open the way.
The Iraqi defenses had been built from a lesson as old as the tank itself. Armor is terrifying when it is moving, but vulnerable when it is stopped. Since the First World War, defenders had searched for ways to halt tanks long enough to kill them. In 1917, mud, trenches, and artillery often did what anti-tank doctrine had not yet fully learned to do. By 1991, the tools were more deliberate. Minefields could channel a tank column into narrow lanes. Berms and ditches could expose vehicles as they climbed or slowed. Bunkers and dug-in positions could keep defenders alive through bombardment. The Iraqi army hoped that if the coalition attacked into this belt, its momentum would bleed away before the real armored battle began.
The ground around the breach did not look dramatic in the way old battlefields sometimes do. There were no castle walls, no forested ridges, no village church towers to give the scene human scale. There was desert, worked by bulldozers, vehicles, and soldiers into a defensive landscape. To follow it without a map, imagine 7th Corps facing north from Saudi Arabia toward Iraqi-held ground. Ahead lay the obstacle belts and defensive positions. Behind the 1st Infantry Division waited forces that needed passage, including the British 1st Armoured Division, which would move through once lanes were opened. Farther beyond, the larger campaign was beginning to swing toward the Republican Guard. The breach was therefore both local and enormous. It happened in a defined place, but the fate of the wider armored maneuver depended on it.
The preparation began before the 1st engineer vehicle touched the obstacle. Coalition air power and artillery had already struck Iraqi positions for weeks, and then intensified support as the ground offensive opened. The point was to weaken defenders, disrupt command, and reduce the volume of fire that could be brought against the soldiers making the breach. But bombardment could not make the mines safe or guarantee that every bunker was empty. In every era, armies have learned that fire support is necessary but not sufficient. It can shake, blind, and suppress. It can make the defender keep his head down. But after the explosions fade,
The attacker must still advance into uncertainty and find out what the fire has actually accomplished. Engineers were the central figures in that uncertainty. Their work was practical, dangerous, and unforgiving. They used specialized vehicles and equipment to push, plow, mark, and blast routes through minefields and obstacles. Line charges could throw explosives across a mined area and detonate a path. Plows and rollers could help tanks and engineer vehicles force lanes through buried danger. Marking teams had to make sure follow-on units knew exactly where to go, because an unmarked breach is almost as dangerous as no breach at all. A lane through a minefield is a promise made to everyone behind it. If that promise is unclear, vehicles drift, formations bunch up, and soldiers begin to move with the sickening knowledge that the ground itself may kill them. For the tank and Bradley crews supporting the breach, the job demanded restraint as well as aggression. Their instinct and training told them to keep moving, to use speed and firepower to dominate. Yet breaching requires patience inside violence. Vehicles had to cover engineers, suppress bunkers, watch flanks, and hold enough order that the lanes did not become chaos. A tank commander might see movement near a trench, hear reports over the radio, watch dust swallow friendly vehicles, and still have to keep his own vehicle positioned for the mission rather than chase every target. This was not the open desert fight that would come later at 73 Easting. It was controlled force, applied through a narrow opening. The Iraqi soldiers in the belt were caught between months of preparation and the shock of the coalition's assault. Some had been battered by air attack and artillery. Some were hungry, exhausted, or demoralized. Some surrendered quickly when the ground forces arrived, knowing that the larger war had turned against them. Others remained dangerous, whether from loyalty, fear, discipline, or simply because a man in a bunker with a weapon can still kill. It is important not to turn them into scenery. The defenders were human beings inside a collapsing military system, and the attackers could not know from a distance which positions would fold and which would fight. That uncertainty made every trench line and bunker a problem to be solved carefully. The Big Red One's breach also showed the difference between tactical success and operational effect. Tactically, the division had to get through mines and defenses, reduce enemy positions, and create usable lanes. Operationally, it had to do those things quickly enough for the wider campaign to keep its rhythm. The British 1st Armoured Division needed to pass through and continue the attack, adding its weight to 7 Corps' eastward drive. A slow breach would not merely delay one division, it could ripple outward through the whole corps, affecting the timing of the turn, the pressure on Iraqi forces, and the chance to reach the Republican Guard before it withdrew or reorganized. In armored war, time lost at a minefield can become opportunity lost 50 miles away. This is why the breach belongs in the same story as 73 Easting, even though it lacks the famous drama of cavalry crews firing through dust. The cavalry fight later in the campaign depended on movement, and movement depended on openings made by engineers and mechanized infantry at the start. The 2D Armored Cavalry Regiment could screen ahead of 7th Corps only because the Corps was able to pass through the defensive crust and enter the deeper battle. A listener might remember the tank duel more easily, but armies remember the lanes. They remember where the obstacles were broken, where the route was marked, where the supporting fires landed, and where the flow of vehicles either continued or stopped. The breach also linked Desert Storm to a much older armored problem. From Cambrai onward, commanders dreamed of tanks breaking the front and racing into the open. Again and again, that dream depended on something humble, crossing the obstacle in front of you. Wire, trenches, mines, ditches, rivers, mud, and rubble have all served the same purpose across the century, forcing armor to slow down and become vulnerable. What changed by 1991 was the sophistication of the combined arms answer. The 1st Infantry Division did not rely on tanks alone to batter through by courage. It used engineers, artillery, mechanized infantry, armor, air support, communications, and careful lane control. The old problem remained ugly, but the tools for solving it had become far more integrated. By the end of the breach, the Iraqi line had not won the kind of delay Saddam needed. Openings existed where obstacles had been meant to deny them. Vehicles could move through marked lanes. British armor could pass forward. 7th Corps could continue building the momentum that would soon carry its cavalry screen toward objective Collins, the 70 Easting limit, and the violent discovery of the Iraqi defense around 73 Easting. The breach did not end the campaign, and it did not destroy the Republican Guard, but it changed the battlefield from a defended border into an opened gate. Once that gate existed, the coalition's greatest advantage, the ability to move heavy forces with speed and coordination, could begin to matter fully.
The breach matters because it reminds us that armored warfare is never only about the glamorous moment when tanks meet tanks. It is also about the men and machines that make movement possible under the worst conditions. It is about engineers working forward, infantry reducing positions, artillery suppressing danger, commanders preserving order, and crews trusting that a marked lane through a minefield is real. Without that work, the Hail Mary would have remained a concept, and 73 Easting would have remained an empty grid line. The old Big Red 1 solved the hard, physical problem at the front of the campaign, and by doing so, handed the Armored Corps its freedom of movement. In the story of modern tank war, that is not a footnote. It is the moment the door opened.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.